Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to this Morris Block lecture series. Thank you for joining us in person today, and also thank you for those who are joining virtually. Today it's my pleasure to introduce Prof. Robert Insall to present, and his title of his talk is Deep Learning: What it is, what it can and can't do for medicine, how it works, and how it's evolving. So Prof. Insall is a professor of mathematical and computational cell biology in the School of Cancer Sciences here in Glasgow. And he's worked here since 2007, having previously worked at the University of Birmingham. And he was awarded Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh in 2014. So Prof. Insall leads a research group on cell migration and chemotaxis. And movement and regulation of cells is highly relevant in cancer because tumor invasion and metastases are common causes of mortality in cancer patients. But what Robert is here to talk to us today is predominantly deep learning. So I'll now hand the floor to Robert. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That go away. So, welcome all today. Now, we wanted preset 2, didn't we? You may now all go to sleep. Welcome. Welcome to all the people online. I guess I must sit where I can be seen. I'm not going. We're coming forward. So let me tell you all about the agenda I'm going to tell you about first. I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I am the person who is talking to you about this. I'm going to talk you through how we get to artificial intelligence, and then I'm going to talk you through what deep learning is. I will talk surprisingly briefly, it turns out, about the medical uses, and then a little bit longer about things you should worry about. And then I don't see too many doctors and pathologists here. But the question that is on the tip of everyone's lips is, will AI replace doctors? And I think you will be appalled by what I have to say. A quick spoiler, I am very often going to diverge into what the AI is telling us about the work we do and how we're doing it. Because that is one of the most interesting things you find out from doing this. Since I started working on deep learning, I found I perceive people differently, which is interesting. You may see why during this. Someone has put in a chat. Let's just check. Sorry, I can't help with sound problems at this. Okay. Can we mute everyone? Yeah.
Just as a reminder, if you could turn your microphones off, people who are joining us virtually, please.
Okay. Enough. So let me start by telling you why I'm doing this. My route to artificial intelligence and deep learning goes like this. I am a cell biologist. I've been a cell biologist for ages. About 15 years ago, something like that, maybe 20 years ago, I started to get somebody has got their microphone turned on at home.
Mute all. Mute all at the bottom.
Oh, there it is. Okay. That doesn't mute me. I've not used that one before. Okay, so I am fully trained as a medical biologist, but 15, 20 years ago, I started getting tired of the way we used words to explain concepts which really needed numbers to explain them. And it was then that I got into mathematical and computational approaches to explaining cell biology. And what I've seen recently, especially working in the Beatson Institute for Cancer Research, is that deep learning is becoming, doubling every year, the way that you will find ways to explain movement in tissues. And from there, you will go on to explain whether patients are going to metastasize and what patient outcomes are going to be. What that leaves me here is as a convert. I'm not an expert. I'm becoming an expert. It's interesting, but I am an evangelist. So I'll perhaps give you a slightly different talk than somebody who was born to machine learning and deep learning would have given. An interesting anecdote that I'm going to start and finish with that has very much shaped the way I see a lot of this. I was explaining why I was doing deep learning to a very senior applied maths professor at a conference. And this maths professor said, "This is awful. I do not want a computer looking at my pathology. The computer will completely fail to miss the obvious feature of the disease that is going to kill me. Whereas a human pathologist would just see it and say, oh, no, we need to give you such and such a drug." And I thought that was a really stupid position, but a position that a lot of people would take. But I was really surprised to see a senior applied mathematician advancing it. It was very eye-opening. So I'll hope to answer this professor at the end of this talk. Okay. Let me talk a little bit. Many of you will know this, some won't. And this is going to be the case all the way through this talk. So the ones who do know what I'm talking about, please bear with me. And the ones who don't, I hope it's clear. So let's start with an algorithm. This is an algorithm. Probably you all know it. It's funny. It's how to deal with anything in engineering terms. If it moves and you don't want it to, duct tape. If it doesn't move and you want it to, WD-40, otherwise have a drink. Interesting that the drink is Corona. I'm not sure you would do that if you were making this now. Okay, the point about algorithms is a programmer writes them. So here's another algorithm. This is how you decide to convert temperatures, and it's got a path, and some programmer has written all of the details of this, and it belongs to that programmer. Artificial intelligence is a development of this, and I'm going to explain it to you with this data set from irises, which was invented by Ron Fisher, who's one of the founders of medical statistics. And he wanted to say, can you diagnose which species an iris is from based on different properties? Its sepal width and length, its petal width and length. And what you see when you plot all of these out is that you can fairly easily segregate iris setosa from the others just by a quick inspection of the data, but the other two are mixed together. So you can write a routine for how to separate them using the complex data, and lots of people have, but this is one of the standard tests for artificial intelligence approaches. We see these irises more than we care to sometimes. And one thing you can do is you can create a decision tree. This is one of very many classical machine learning approaches, where classical machine learning means working on small sets of numbers. So you can use the data that you've got to train the computer. You can say we've got all these numbers for sepal and petal length, and the outcome we want is the species. And so the computer makes use of the data you've given it, and the computer boils these data and these classes that you've fed it with into a series of yes and no questions. And that can be used to form a tree. And that tree then lets you infer the answers from the questions. And there is a decision tree about the irises that I made a couple of days ago. So obviously, the decision tree says exactly the same as me. You can just have a quick look, and you can immediately ask one question, which is, are the petals 2.4 or less? And then you can segregate off one population from that. And then you have to go and ask more detailed questions to segregate the rest. And this is a really nice illustration of a simple artificial intelligence problem. What I've shown you here in this tree, it is an algorithm. And the computer's stopped. Right, there we are. But the computer generated that algorithm. None of the decisions in that and none of the numbers in that tree came from me. I just loaded up the computer with the data and it made that tree. This tree could, in theory, be used to classify any iris you have in the future anywhere else if you got those measurements. So we have learned something that is general, we hope. It's sort of explainable. I mean, it is explainable because you can see all the questions in the tree, but you wouldn't want to try and keep that in your mind and explain it to your mother-in-law. And above all, there's no single solution and there's no validity of this solution over any other. So if you do it again, look at this top thing on the tree. If you run it again, then it comes up with a different tree. The tree looks the same and the sorts of decision it needs to make are the same, but the actual decisions at each point are different. And this different tree should also classify any iris that you meet in the future. Now, let me just pull out and do the first break. I've presented this as very run of the mill, but actually what we've done here is actually quite game changing because the algorithm that I showed you was not written by me or a programmer. It was written by a program that someone wrote a long time ago, but nobody has ownership of it. It was generated externally. So the emphasis is no longer on having somebody writing code in an office. The emphasis is on feeding this thing that was coded a long time ago with data and training it to answer the question that you want to. The emphasis is training, not writing programs. And you start seeing the obvious point that the quality of the data that you train it with is absolutely paramount. I've said you could measure any iris in the future and put it in the species. But if the data that I used to train that tree were not complete, or some of them were not correct, then although it's an algorithm, although it worked with the data we've got, it's not going to work generally. So that's an example of artificial intelligence. That's an example of what we call classical machine learning. How do we become deep learning? And I'm always amused by this because people hate the name deep learning. But it's actually rather simple. So one kind of classical machine learning is this. It's called a neural net because each of these little circles behaves sort of analogously to a human neuron. And in the green, you could put each of your input parameters, the sepal length and width and the petal length and width, and then you could have some number of hidden variables. Each of these hidden variables connects to all of the four input variables, but with a different weight. So each of these lines, each of these arrows connecting the input to the hidden layer may have a weight. The weight may be positive or negative. It may be big and it may be small. Okay, and then you can do the same thing from a hidden layer to an output. And if the parameters are organized right, then the output will correctly reflect the species of the input just based on collecting these numbers and making generalizations out of them. That's a simple neural net. Each weight of each arrow here can be trained. And again, the devil is in training it. There is one thing that is incredibly important in all of these approaches, which is you have to be selective. So when you take each weight and add them all up, then what you're going to do is do a thing called an activation function, and you're going to take the number that has been generated in each of those blue hidden layers, and if it's greater than 1, you're going to keep it, and if it's less than 1, you're going to junk it. So every step you move down this network, you are complexifying the information by multiplying several different, adding several different weighted assessments of the things upstream, and you're junking information by removing anything that comes out negative. So here's a slightly deeper neural network. In this case, each hidden layer, and the first hidden layer talks to a second set of neurons in the second hidden layer. And obviously you can make the network as wide as you like, and you can make it as deep as you like. So what a deep network looks like is loads and loads and loads of layers vertically coming in the depth towards me, with each layer feeding sometimes in a complex way to the next one. And this network, which is a little bit old-fashioned and excessively complex, but gives you a very nice illustration of just how complex these things can be, has 13,000 layers, slightly more. It has 140 million different weights in it, from the arrows by which each point in each layer is connected to each point in the next layer. And if you were training this network, you would have to get accurate assessments of 140 million weights to make it useful. So the reason it's deep is nothing philosophical or nothing to do with the sales pitch. It's just to do with the number of layers that are between your input data and your output data. And the idea in having all of these layers is that each time you move from a layer near the data downwards, the idea, the data that it's dealing with gets a little bit more abstracted. So instead of just having a set of numbers, you hope that each layer has a better assessment of patterns in the numbers, or signs that correlate with something that is important to your outcome. So the idea behind deep networks is actually really simple, even though the networks themselves are horribly complicated and difficult. The idea is that you have many layers of abstraction. Each layer abstracts some of the features from the layer above it, closer to the data. So the deeper layers are more abstracted. Each layer, I should also say, junks a proportion of the data from the layer above. And each weight is trained by a training process. And the training process tries to drive the abstractions from just raw data into those things that you're interested in. And it doesn't matter what you're interested in. If you have a complex enough network, and if you train it right, which is to say you constantly make it reflect the things that you're interested in, then the network will take your data in the front and abstract it into whatever idea you were looking for. It's a marvelous idea, and practically it tends to be true. So the idea is that if the network is complex enough, and if you're training of it to make the outputs match what you want to find the patterns from the input, if the network is complex enough and the training is good enough, then it must work. Now, you all understand that the word if is doing an awful lot of work here. And a great number of people are spending a great deal of time and money and effort working on that if. But the underlying idea is just that. If you have a system for complexifying and abstracting information, and it's both complex enough and trainable enough, then it will work if you keep shaking it. So then you ask the question, because more or less everything that I'm considering from medical work is considering images, and then you ask, well, this works for a set of 4 numbers. How then will I feed an image, a picture like this, into the thing that considers a set of 4 numbers? And I think probably more than half of the audience know exactly what the answer to this, but perhaps half don't, which is that digital images, there is nothing more to a digital image than a series of numbers. So here is something I use when lecturing on this subject. This is a matrix, a 50 by 50 matrix of numbers. You can see just about that each of them is a number between 0 and 255. And that's all it is. Just simple numbers. But you can see that there's a bit of a pattern in these numbers. Now, if I take every 0 and replace it with 0 light, which is to say pure black, and if I take every 255 and replace it with full on light, which is to say white, and I make all the numbers in between proportional, so numbers nearer 0 are darker and numbers nearer 255 are whiter, then this array of numbers becomes this. And I just have to emphasize, I'm not changing anything to do this. These are exactly equivalent. You can represent a number by digits, or you can represent a number by a color from white to black, but it is the same thing. I'm not changing it. So this image is just a long series of numbers, and I can feed it into a deep network the same way I could feed it, such as I've described to you, the same way that I would feed any other numbers in. And that is how you feed images into a deep network. And the outcome, if you feed these into, for example, the deep network that is called YOLO 3 here, is that the deep network has been trained to identify in that huge pattern of numbers that is this image anywhere where there is a dog, and point it. Here you are, that's a dog. You see I know it is because YOLO 3 tells me so. And a bicycle, and a truck. And it is astonishing, and yet it is simple. Because YOLO 3 is a big, enormously complex network. We have an awful lot of images of dogs and bicycles. So if you troll the internet and look for images of dogs and bicycles and a few other classes and then annotate them, you can get zillions. And there is a widely used database of 14 million images, which has been classified into dogs and bicycles and kittens and about 200 other such classifiers. And everyone who tries to train deep networks like this can go and get this collection of images and this collection of annotations and just use them. So there is a fundamental problem when you take a huge complex network and try and train it, which is the thing we call the curse of dimensionality, and you will hear that from time to time. And the point is, if you have a network with 140 million parameters in it, and each of those parameters must be accurately trained, then you probably need the order of 140 million images to train it properly. You can use dodges to get around the curse of dimensionality and make it a little bit less problematical. But the big problem that underscores pretty much all uses of deep learning in medicine is that we could make a huge network, like YOLO 3 or VGG. But the bigger and more complex the network is, while it gets more potent, it also takes much more work to train and validate and so forth properly. So an image like this is working exactly the same as the yellow I showed you. This is a paper that is using a deep network to identify brain metastases. But compared to the dog detector, YOLO 3, it's a little bit cruder, and it needs slightly more straightforward information to get it. But the idea is exactly the same. We've taken a hugely complex network, we've fed in lots of images of brains, and we've trained it based on identifying where the metastases were, and we've shaken all the parameters until the output agrees with what we want. So just a short philosophy break. That's a pity. The animation got crushed as it came from the Mac. If you try and ask what other systems do we know that work the same way as this, babies work exactly the same way as this. They constantly receive images and stimuli. And what they try and do is get towards some degree of abstraction and comprehension and improving their own picture. So part of the reason that deep networks are so successful at understanding the sort of information that we want to understand, if they work the same sort of way. Now, there's this point at the bottom that's getting scribbled on here. I'm not saying that that baby is a deep network. Neurons in a baby are not the same as the neurons in a deep network. That would be crass. But the sort of underlying strategy is the same. But it's also exactly the same for a medical student or a trainee pathologist or anything like that. What we do with a medical student is we constantly feed them images, and then we tell them what the right answer is. And then at the end of the year, we send them in to do exams. And if they can match the right answer that we wanted them to get to the image that we fed them, then they get positive reinforcement. And if they do it wrong, then they get kicked out. It's exactly the same underlying strategy. And that is why, compared to other approaches, mathematical and computational approaches, that's why there's this sense of familiarity to all of this. Okay, I'm really sorry. This is a terrible whistle-stop tour, and I would love it if any of you afterwards tell me which bits are useful to you and which bits are obvious and you know already, because I'm hoping to cover an awful lot of ground in a very short time. Can deep learning create an image, as well as classify an image? What I've shown you is all a classification problem. You go from an image to abstraction. And the answer is, of course, yes, or I wouldn't be posing it to you, but the way it works is really quite striking and quite staggering. So if you take one of these deep networks that you've used to convert an image into an abstraction, and then you reverse it, and then you feed the abstraction end of it with just white noise, then what you get is your abstraction then sort of back calculated to make some kind of image. And obviously, if you start doing that initially, the image is going to be absolute nonsense because you're feeding in white noise and you don't know what's coming out. But there's this class of deep network called a generative adversarial network, a GAN, in which you train it by harnessing the generator that is taking noise and feeding into the abstractions and making an image out of it, and then a discriminator, which is a deep network which compares the image that was made by your generator with some training set, some set of things that you want it to look like, some set of pictures and so forth. And you train this over and over and over again with enough data. What happens is that the generator gets better and better and better at making images that will fool the discriminator. And the discriminator gets better and better and better at working out how to tell the difference between real images in the data set and the random images that the generator are making. And if you keep training these and you feed them enough data and so forth, then what you get is a generator that is able to generate a picture that can fool a deep learning network. And if you want to see some examples of this, there's a website called This Cat Does Not Exist. And if you go, every time you connect to This Cat Does Not Exist, it generates you a cat. And this cat purely exists in silico. This cat exists because I logged onto thiscatdoesnotexist.com, and this is the cat it made for me. It's quite attractive. Like, I could live with a cat like that. It's much nicer than my cat. There's another one. That's the second time I logged onto it, and so on and so forth. You can generate an arbitrary number of cats, and they are all indistinguishable from real cats. It is astonishing how good these cats are, when all we have done is taken a pack of numbers and shaken them. But we've used a complex enough network that is organized in the right way. Okay, this gets a little bit scary at some point, because when you go to This Person Does Not Exist, you meet this nice guy. This person also doesn't exist. This person is also a slightly bigger and better GAN. It's about 2 years later than This Cat Does Not Exist. But I would challenge any of you to see this picture and say, this is not a real picture who you could have a beer or a cup of tea or a conversation about deep learning with. And sometimes it goes a little bit wrong because the discriminator has different criteria than you and I. I'm a little bit worried about this guy's glasses. They don't quite seem to follow physics, but the discriminator doesn't follow physics. You and I know about the physics of glasses. If we trained the discriminator with something that taught it about the physics of glasses, this wouldn't happen. Also, have you ever seen someone with one ear that looks like that and one ear that looks like that? Maybe he was a boxer. Sometimes they go quite badly wrong. So this person, you see the middle part of the image, which is what the training is focusing on, is perfect. She also has this problem that her ears are non-symmetrical and have non-earrings. And then also this thing, which is something from the surroundings, is quite bad. But if you look at these images, I had to get 20 of them before I got one that was as clearly wrong as this. And most of the images you get from This Person Does Not Exist, you would really struggle to separate them from a person. Now, about half of this audience are academics and about half are junior academics, going to be academics. This bit is really scary. So I asked a word-based generative network to write this talk. Can you write it? Can you read it? It began, so all I wrote was write a presentation on AI in medicine. And there is this language model called GPT-3, and you can get it if you go and look at openai.com. You have to register, but anyone can. And I said, write a presentation on AI in medicine. It's done quite a nice job, probably better than me, I'm afraid. And it has ended with this thing saying the future of healthcare is AI. So there you are. Now I'm going to do something more scary. Here's an essay I set last year. And the way GPT-3 works is it scours all the text it can find in Google, all the text it can find on the web. So it's got a huge corpus of data to train it. And it's a hugely complex model. And the net combination is that if somebody handed this essay in, it's not brilliant. You can actually see the faults in it. You can see that it didn't really understand actin polymerization. But still, I think if I was marking this, it would get somewhere between a C and a D. And I just give the philosophical question to everyone involved in academia. If the generative network is getting between a C and a D, then what are you doing with your students who are getting D's and E's? It's really quite interesting. One thing I haven't done, which I wanted to do, is to put one of these generated essays through Turnitin. But I think there would not be a problem because it's not copying together people's bits of work. It's got an abstraction of the idea of an essay on actin polymerization, and then it's populating it by reversing a deep network. But as a philosophical concept, it really is quite interesting. How am I doing for time? About right, I think. Okay, medical uses of deep learning. When I set out to write this talk, I expected I would spend most of the time working on this, but I actually found that it was quite boring. Some of the things are very, very interesting, like the first big use of deep learning in the NHS was in trying to understand forms that were filled out by doctors and surgeons and so forth, and trying to extract information from them in a coherent way. And it's not just the troubles you'd think that doctors infamously scribble, but it's that doctors have 23 different words to say the same thing, all of which have different degrees of nuance in them. So there is actually a reason why they use the different words sometimes. Sometimes it's just that they're different. And they're doctors and surgeons. So often it's not convenient to them to write the thing in the box it's supposed to be, but they write it somewhere else. And then it's there on the form and whoever's intelligent can see and get it out. But a simple algorithm will not get it out. Okay, going into the sort of deep learning things that I'm familiar with, the images, you can use exactly the same algorithm as I showed you for detecting doggies and kittens and bicycles. And you can apply it to something nice and two-dimensional and crisp, like an MRI image. And there are thousands of papers out doing this, and they're very, very good. This is one such. As you see, it's classifying an MRI, mid-body MRI, into aorta, stomach, spleen, and metastases. So this patient is really not very well. But it actually starts getting, again, a little bit scary if you haven't thought about this. So this is a relatively recent paper on, sorry, this was all animated when I wrote it, but Glasgow IT has flattened it a bit. Never mind, it's a paper talking about automating chest x-rays. Chest x-rays are much more difficult. They're much more woolly and diffuse and variable. But if you look at the success that the deep learning gets, and you compare it with any old doctor that you've pulled in off the street, a professional radiologist, a lung radiologist, and the deep learning, you see that the deep learning is an awful lot better already than the radiologist about classifying the #1 feature that you find in this image. That didn't surprise me at all. but I expect it comes as quite a surprise to several of the audience. Likewise with cancer pathology, actually this is quite well known, you've probably heard this. If you have a melanoma, then a deep learning will tell you much more accurately, looking at it through a dermoscope, whether it's malignant or not, than a professional dermatologist can tell you. And that's been known for ages. I see that I copied this from The Guardian for you, and it warned me it was more than 4 years old. This has been known. And so on and so on and so on and so on. And the reason I'm not going to go through all the areas of medicine in which the deep learning is better at extracting information from an image than the professional physician goes like this. If you can train a person, you can train deep learning to do it. Maybe it's been done already, probably. Maybe it hasn't been done yet, because in order to train it to see what a physician sees, you need to get the physician to spill the beans and annotate the data sets and so forth. And you need an expert in deep learning to find the right deep learning routine to do it all. And there's an awful lot of knowledge in medicine, an awful lot of physicians and an awful lot of pathologists. But if you can train a person, you can train a deep learning network to do it. And actually, probably the deep learning is going to end up doing much better than the physician. Why is the deep learning going to end up better than the physician? I am not so crass as to think that it's just much cleverer, but it's a computer. It doesn't argue with its teenage daughter over breakfast before coming out. It doesn't have diseases that occupy its mind while it's sitting there looking at your screen. It's much more consistent. It's much quicker. It doesn't get bored if you give it 300 images of sections through livers and say, score the metastases in each of these. It scores the first one the same as the last one. So it's not more intelligent, it's just more single-minded. And if a person can't be trained to look at an image and conclude the data you want from it, probably a deep learning can't either. Probably there's just not the information there. But actually, there are things that people are really not very good at that we can make use of in the deep learning. A very good example is multiplex pathology. So humans are very good at seeing 3 colors. I would think that probably a certified pathologist can see just about anything that a deep learning can see in a 3-color normal image. With multiplex pathology, you can have 30 different colors, and the human brain is just not very good at looking at 30 colors at once. It doesn't have the wires. But with a deep learning, we just define the deep learning better. We say it's going to be 30 channels long instead of 3 channels long. It works exactly the same way, rather slower. But so looking at multiplex pathology, for example, I'm not sure a person can do it, but the deep learning probably will be able to. So I'm not going to insult your intelligence by giving you a whole list of things where the medics are slowly being succeeded because it's happening generally. Here's another thing. This is my own work. This is the only thing I'm going to show of my own work here. But we have a problem which is that pathologists in cancer order an awful lot of immunohistochemistry. So use an antibody to identify a particular antigen in a tumor, but it's expensive and it's slow. And it relies on you having exactly the right antibody to do what you want. So Chris Walsh in my group has trained a deep learning network on a whole load of immunohistochemistry, and then trained it to take an H&E image, a standard snapshot of a tissue, and infer from it what AE1, AE3, which is cytokeratin, would look like. So this image here on the right is completely synthetic, and you can watch it doing it, and it's just absolutely awesome. And quite a lot of people confronted with something like this will say, this is really quite good. This is nearly as good as the real thing. But actually, this is quite a lot better than the real thing. Why is it quite a lot better than the real thing? Because practically, if you are doing immunohistochemistry, sometimes the images fold, or they get overstained, or you get a hole in it somewhere, or something like that. But when we're training this, we remove all the images where the staining's not good. So it's been trained only to make what a pathologist said was high quality data. And it is just absolutely awesome. And you can use this, you see, to infer where the bits of the tumor that are escaping the bits that are metastasizing and migrating out. It's absolutely remarkable. And that leads me to another little philosophy break, which is we spend such a lot of effort in the cancer field trying to make these very, very highly specific reagents that will give us one simple answer. And looking at this, I wonder if what we really ought to be doing is not trying to pretend that we can make perfect silver bullet answers that will tell us exactly what something is, but use something like deep learning to collect a range of not very precise, not very definable knowledge. And I think that philosophical difference from the field is probably the way things will go over the next 10 or 20 years. Drug discovery. This paper is hugely dubious, but the process of drug discovery is obviously suiting something like a deep learning network better than a huge army of chemists just making things at random. So it may not be terribly strongly with us now, but it will be. And so on and so on and so forth. The thing that you're not seeing very much at the moment is the computer looking at the images and the computer deciding what is interesting. So the thing that I've told you about mostly is about things where you get a physician or a pathologist or somewhere to annotate the tissue, and then you get the computer to recreate that. But the thing that we are working on and are the most hopeful for now, although it's very difficult, is self-supervised learning, where you just shove images of quality into the tissue, into the computer, and let it select all the different things that may be features that may be interesting. And then you have a load of features, and then you have to decide how to correlate them with disease or the patient status or what have you. So that will be here, but is not here at the moment. Okay. I said I'd be 45 minutes, so I must be quick about things you should worry about. The clear point here, and I hope I've made it clear enough, is that the training and the training data is everything. It's not the programmer. It's not the person that constructs the network, although those two people are important, but it's the training data and how good it is and how well it's annotated or whether it represents all the things you want it to. So there was a great big fuss about 3 years ago, something like that, about Google Translate being biased. And the fuss went like this. If you translate something that is not gendered, like a Turkish word for nurse, and you translate it using Google Translate into English or similar, then it genderizes the terms. And it pretty much always genderizes engineers as men and nurses as women. And this is bad and biased, and it should not do it. But you see, the thing is, the way Google Translate works is it looks at all the language that is available on the net, and it looks at how to convert all the language that is available on the net to the language, to a related language. And the trouble is, all the language in the net is seriously biased. So if you train a deep network on all the language off the net, you will get the serious bias that is there. And this article here from the New York Post, Google Translate's algorithm has a gender bias, it's terribly unfair. Why is it terribly unfair? Well, the first thing is, for the reasons I've told you, it's not the algorithm, it's what they trained it on. And they said what they trained it on, they're not lying to anyone, it's just that culture is biased. But the other thing is they perfectly illustrated why it was unfair on the same page. Because you see, culture is terribly biased. So if you use what you find out there as your training data, then you get lots of creepy butt taps of 16-year-olds. And you can bet that if New York Post is talking about creepy butt taps, that it's a female and not a male person that it's referring to. And there's exactly the same story in the Mail. And if you ever grab a copy of the whole front page of the Mail, you can see exactly the same thing. Anger at Google Translate for being biased, and then slew of bias all the way around it on the same page. You would not dream of saying, doctors may be biased, so we must never use doctors. That would be the most moronic thing to say. And in exactly the same way, you can't say AI tends to be biased, so we mustn't use AI. What you should say is we must find ways to train our AI that are not biased or that do not reflect biases we don't want. If your training's biased, your decisions will be. Now, here's a second worry. Something like a GAN will fit something to what it's been taught on. Something like deep learning will infer from your data only from those options that it has been given to infer things from. GANs in particular have this problem, and GANs are so powerful that they're very worrying, but they're trained to be convincing. The generator is being trained to fool the discriminator. It's not being trained to simulate a real person or generate someone who really existed. It's being trained to simulate a plausible one. So you have this extraordinary thing you can do with a GAN. I mean, again, it boggles the mind it's possible to do this. You take an image and you scrub all of it apart from that. And then you tell the GAN, okay, regenerate the original image that this came from. And it does an awesome job, except that it didn't have the hat because its training data didn't give it enough to conclude that someone with those eyes probably has a hat on. So it's amazing that it does it, but it's done it wrong because its training data did not consider whether it had a hat or not, or it's either got to have a hat or not. You note it doesn't say there's a 50% chance we've got a hat here or a 10% chance. It just goes for what it thinks is the most likely. Now, this can be really awful. So if you take that person and scrub out the middle of his face, and you ask a GAN to regenerate it, the GAN gives you that. Now, there's so much going on here. So the first thing is, again, it's just mind-boggling that it's possible for this to happen at all. You think how little information it's got, but the person that has generated is a completely different person from the person that it's trying to reconstruct. So if this was medical data you were doing, if that was an image of a tumor that you were trying to reconstruct, you'd remove the wrong organ from the patient, or you'd remove the wrong bit, or you'd do, because the GAN has given you a convincing, beautiful map showing what it is, but it's wrong. It's just an invention of the GAN. And again, you can guard against all of this, but you have to know how to guard against it, and you have to work to do it. And then, of course, you have the obvious thing that the suggestion is that the data set that trained this GAN had more people who look like this than people who look like that. And this all comes down to lack of data. Kitten features, there's zillions of them. Properly annotated medical data, there's some of it lying around the web, but it's very, very biased because it's what anyone's chosen to put there. If you want to go and get good unbiased data, you have to pay a bunch of physicians or pathologists or someone to go and annotate your data for you. And that's very expensive, and even then for being complete. One more worry is, can you explain what deep learning concludes? And you can't at the moment, but we're working on it. And actually, I think that is going to be less and less a problem. Here's a nice approach to doing it. This is a structure called an attention layer. And the attention layer shows which parts of the image were important in making the decision. And you see, as you train the network more and more and more, it's focusing more and more and more on the, I think that looks like a pancreas, and that's a lobe of a liver, and that's perhaps a spleen. You can see how the network is focusing on particular things. With tools like that, we can't necessarily make AI explainable, but we can make it more explainable. And then one of the things I learned from doing all of this is that actually, although we think we can explain human doctors, it turns out to be much more complex. So when we were doing the counting the tumor bud exercise I showed you from our own work, the pathologists all did much better than us. And we didn't really understand it at all, because when we looked at the guidance that we were following, our network was absolutely perfect. It really was not making any mistakes at all. So we took the whole data set and we engaged a doctor, and the doctor said, well, of course, you don't want to do that. There's a bit of tissue next door that is adipose. And there's nothing in the rules about if there's a bit of tissue next door that's adipose, you mustn't look at it. But the physician knew perfectly well. And actually, it turns out to go much deeper than that. You're supposed to pick areas at random, but proper pathologists don't pick areas at random. They pick the areas where they're going to find the best results, but they have learned that, and it is not in the rules. And the net result is They are very good and they are very successful and they are much better than our network, but they're not as explainable perhaps as we thought they were. Final one. Should I trust deep learning with my health? And the answer, I'm sorry, the animations have spoiled the punchline of my joke. But so, should you trust a doctor with your health? Absolutely not. Should you trust a doctor with your health if you know where they went to medical school and you know that they passed their exams? Yes, of course you would. You see the difference? Should I trust an AI if you know that it has been properly trained and if you know that it has been properly validated, then you probably should. Okay, so I can end with my answer to the maths professor. The answer to the maths professor is you have been watching too much of this. And if in any case a doctor came at you with one of those, you should run a mile. But what the maths professor was worried about is the weird disease that only the expert pathologist knows he's got. And there are two answers to that. The first answer is, if you are a pathology trainee, 1 in every X images you get to see is a weird disease, and you are carefully trained to see if there is something offbeat that you should be getting. That's part of the training. If we trained the deep networks to do that, they would get that. The second thing is, if you have a melanoma, there is this point where you're trying to decide, should I have chemotherapy or should I not have chemotherapy, where a % or 2 either way in the decision will make a couple of % either way to whether you survive or not. And that's what chooses whether you live or die. The pathologist seeing the weird disease that nobody had ever seen before, that might just happen, but let's face it, it's not going to. But getting the decision right about how much chemo you have and whether you have it, that is what saves your life. And if the data shows that an AI does that better, then you, Mr. Senior Maths Professor, should use the AI and not just ask a pathologist to look at the image. Which gets me to the final question, will AI replace doctors? And the answer is obviously no. What we do want to see is doctors who have AI replacing doctors who do not have AI. But obviously we need doctors because we need doctors to understand context and how things are improving and human beings and things that we cannot train networks to. What deep networks do, if they take static pictures or movies that someone has taken and make defined decisions from them, what we want doctors to do is consider the context of the patient, consider how the evolution of the disease, consider the evolution of the field. What we want pathologists to do is to know the right tests to do, the broader meaning, the outcomes and so forth. This will always happen. The invention of steam shovels did not make work people irrelevant. It just meant that they could do more and they could do better and they could do different things. AI is wonderful for physicians, pathologists and the like. It just means that they can do more and they can concentrate on the stuff that they're the best at because the computer is the best at some other things. Thank you.
Thank you. Perfect. Thank you for a fascinating and a wonderfully engaging presentation. First of all, I'll invite any questions from the floor.
Thank you very much. That was really accessible. Thank you. What's the difference between self-supervision and unsupervised training?
Unsupervised is a very broad field in which you ask the computer to classify your data. Self-supervised is a particularly narrow set of algorithms within deep learning that says we are going to train the deep learning to recognize specific features within images. So self-supervised is a rather tiny subset of unsupervised.
One of your comments was if the network is complex enough. So what's the trade-off if it's over complex? Is there any detriment to the performance?
Yes, actually, one of the things that's always surprising, which we were talking about on the way here, is this cursive dimensionality is worse than just making things difficult. If your network is too complex for you to train properly, it will do worse than a simpler network, even if a more complex network that was trained with enough data would be the optimal thing. And you can actually make your numbers into gobbledygook by over-complexifying the system you use, because all the noise from all the parameters that are not accurately trained swamps the correct thing that you're trying to infer. So the cursive dimensionality, maybe the cursive dimensionality is the wrong name. Maybe it should be the need for appropriate dimensionality. But in medical data, that really is a problem, because the complexity of the sort of question you're asking is very large, and the availability of images that answer all the questions you'd like is relatively limited.
Thank you. Come here first and then to the middle.
Thanks, Ron. That was a lovely talk. So one of the secrets we don't tell you as doctors is that diagnoses aren't binary. They aren't a 1 and 0. And well, I treat inflammation, and inflammation is right in the right setting and wrong in the wrong setting. So it's different to cancer. And at some arbitrary points, it becomes a problem. And that may depend on the patient, their life, as much as the medical side. How do you deal with that in AI? And there's a real risk that you're going to take data from clinical trials where everyone's got the diagnosis because we take phase 3 studies, rather than real world where people have a range of symptoms which in different tissues which may or may not be disease. And it's very much noisier than an image.
So all of these systems may, if you ask them to, give you a % chance of an outcome rather than categorically choosing one outcome or another. The reason we tend to make it classify is it's much easier to measure whether it's right or wrong or what have you. You may have seen one of the graphs I showed top 1 accuracy, and that means that the system is getting the most probable answer every time. But there are lots of other measures of whether a network is doing. We use top 5 accuracy, where it chooses 1, and that 1 is in the top 5 it could be, or it chooses 5, and included in that 5 is what you would think of the correct diagnosis. So if I were trying to offer you a deep network to solve some problem like what you're describing, I'd want to make sure that it gave a bunch of probabilities. And I would probably want to make sure it had something like an attention layer showing which bits of the image I had derived the opinion from. And then that's the stuff that the network is good at. And I would ask you to then go and do the stuff that you're good at.
It's very interesting, because that's actually probably what I've done more and more as I've got more senior. I've been happy saying you're not normal, you don't have the disease, but actually you fall in this middle.
Yes.
And then we have that discussion. So
yes,
that would fit well with the senior doctor, I guess.
Yes, the funny thing is, I think quite a lot of patients, and certainly quite a lot of consumers of deep learning, are very unhappy with it and want a categorical answer, even when a categorical answer is not appropriate. But that, again, is a problem with society, not a problem with doctors or of deep learning.
That was really interesting. Thanks. At the beginning of the summer, a colleague brought me a block of 600 slices, an EM block, 600 slices, and asked me if we could try and pull out some of the structures. And we tried a few of the plugins like Deep Image J and stuff, and PG. In the end, we decided we could get the mitochondria out, but we just did it all by hand. I spent my entire summer just coloring in, as he did, and one of the students. We ended up with a really fantastic 3D data set. But I'm now start thinking, do I use the individual slices to train an algorithm, or is there some way to do this in 3D? Where we've got a block of data, but with the 3D labels. I don't know how to do it in 3D, unless you know anything.
You can, it's a really complicated and a really good question. I mean, you can do it in 3D because the computer doesn't care whether you train a 2D slice or a 3D block or a 4D hyperstack, but you don't have enough data to train. The complexity of a 3D image is vast, and you don't have enough data to do it. Probably what you are talking about is not actually an issue for deep learning as it is at the moment, as I know it, I should say. I'm not expert in this area. Probably that's an area for a mathematician to try and take your slices and use them to make an approximation of a 3D. What I would do if I was doing it is I'd try and use the 2D slices that you have to train a 2D classifier that says where the mitochondria are and where their outlines are. And then I would go and get a mathematician to try and use all that 2D data I got to try and infer 3D mathematically. Sorry, that's maybe verbose answer, but it's to the point.
Hi, I'll introduce myself. So my name is Cara. I'm a GP, so there was another doctor in the audience. I'm a medical educator and a new academic fellow.
Well,
The one issue I had, or question I had around, was that statement you said that if you can train a person to do it, then deep learning can sort of do the same. And I think the issue I have with that, or what I feel isn't taken into consideration, is the complexity of clinical practice. So you're absolutely right. With students, we do that. We feed them sorts of things like chest x-rays, and if they get the right answer, boom, you're good to go. But so much of the training happens in a postgraduate setting. And I feel like where AI becomes dangerous is that it's based on the premise of single disease frameworks. And I would say, as a primary care physician, I wish the majority of my clinical practice was based on fitting patients into algorithms. In fact, it's the opposite. My daily challenge is trying to figure out how to deal with those patients. So my question to you is that, taking into consideration that element, is it actually true, because we train doctors to be able to handle these complex case scenarios, that if you can train a person to train AI, and so yeah, what do you feel that statement needs to be adjusted, or?
Well, I hope I said it. So the first thing is the point you are making there is exactly the point I was trying to make at the end. But I do not think AI replaces doctors. I think it helps doctors. And the more clearly we keep that in mind, the better we'll do. So I hope I said at the point that you were referring to, that if you are trying to extract information out of an image, and as far as extracting information out of an image goes, I will absolutely stick with it. But you are not describing extracting information out of an image. You're describing how you evolve from extracting information out of an image to dealing with a human being with complexities. So if your image shows something with several morbidities, then you can train the deep learning to recognize several morbidities. That's not a problem. But I think the problem that you are perhaps training up is that the image is not the patient. The image is just a summary. And the AI is not seeing the patient. The AI is just seeing the image. So I think if you can train a person to infer the data from the image, you can train the AI. And I'm completely agnostic about the patient, but I would rather see a doctor in person. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. So then AI is a tool.
AI is a tool for extracting knowledge from images.
Exactly.
Or from DNA sequences, or from words, or what have you. But doctor's job is to use all those different tools that we can offer you, and do better at actually diagnosing the patients. And I would hope that with all the AIs that are going to become available to you in 10 years, you get much more information, much more beautifully cooked before you actually start talking to the patient. Then you'll have more time to do this difficult stuff because of the AI. That's the hope.
I think that's why I said the comment, thank God, because throughout the whole presentation, I was like, how, what, where? So I think that idea that is a tool, and that you can't actually train it to do everything, is quite important.
Strictly images.
Yes.
In the interest of fairness, I'm going to take a question from, from the virtual.
Yes. Hello, virtual.
audience.
Sorry. Oh, sorry.
I think you can keep standing there. So this is a question from Vital. Is it and should it be standard practice for adequacy of performance to be assessed across different social groups before use, e.g. checking that a new algorithm performs adequately for different ethnic groups?
Yeah, that's a good question. And obviously, yes. The trouble is, and you, Jim, and others in social science will know this, you cannot legislate lack of bias. All you can do is you can try and find areas of bias that you know about and try and work against them. So there is an obvious problem, has been an obvious problem with deep learning, where the deep learning data sets were made by Californians. And so GANs always tend to make people who look like Californians. And obviously, if you are trying to make something about patients in general, you have to be training your data on patients in general. So yes, absolutely. There's a really horrible thing happened in America a while ago, where it turned out that predictions of criminality were horribly biased, but from deep learning, were horribly biased by socioeconomic status. And it turned out that the deep network was trained on police's estimation of whether or not people were criminal or not, and the police who provide the training data were biased. So of course the outcome was. So the answer is yes, absolutely. You've got to look at different sexes, different groups, different races, and you've probably got to look at other things before. Again, you see, when I say we still need doctors and we still need pathologists, we still need medical researchers. And we still need medical researchers to go into these things and say, I am looking for a bias, or I think something is wrong here. And if you find it, you can correct it. If you don't find it, then it's going to stay festering in there and bias your outcome, make your outcome less good. So yes, absolutely, couldn't agree more.
Great. And perhaps just a final question, and appreciate we're over time, so if people have to leave, then please do. But there is a question here around sort of training. So AI, ML, etc. is changing the world of medicine daily, and we can't underemphasize the domain knowledge. I'm sure, and it's about training. Is there any way to get a master's in data science or AI for doctors? The requirements are limiting because it is compulsory to have a BSc in maths or computer science. For more doctors to be involved in AI, what are the options for this kind of career path?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. That's a wonderful place to sign off. I do thank you, the person who's out there. I mean, that is what I've been trying to do for some time. I would like there to be a set of courses for practicing physicians and medical students. The first one would have to be about 2 days long, I think. 2 days is a sort of rational, and it could be part of people's CPD and so forth. And there could be another one that would be 1 evening a week for 3 months, and so on and so forth. But the trouble is, there is this big shortage of physician time. There is a huge shortage of time from qualified deep learners and AI experts and so forth. In particular, there is a shortage of those people who like explaining to people who are not themselves geeks. But it really, really, really ought to happen. We really ought to be able to do this.
Great, fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. Thanks everyone for coming, and please look out the next Morris block, which I think
9th of September.
Can I advertise? Yeah, sorry, this morning. Thank you. Good.